My name is Claire, and the moment I pulled that soggy savings book from the trash bin at my mother's graveside, I knew my entire life was about to shatter in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The funeral was suffocating. Too many flowers, too many lies whispered by people who barely knew her. My mother had raised me alone, worked double shifts at the hospital for 30 years, and built something sacred with her own hands. That savings book represented every sacrifice, every missed birthday, every time she'd chosen my future over her own. When I opened it at the cemetery, Marcus grabbed my wrist, so hard I felt the bones shift. "Bury that piece of paper with it," he hissed, his face twisted in a rage I'd never seen before. Not sadness, not grief. Pure, animalistic rage. I didn't think. I just ran. The bank manager's face went white as I stood there, dripping wet earth on his mahogany desk, the account number trembling in my hands. He made the call before I could even speak. "Don't go anywhere," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine with something that looked like pity. That's when I understood. Marcus didn't want that book buried because of what it said about my mother. He wanted it buried because of what it revealed about him. The police officer sat across from me in that sterile bank office, her notebook open, her expression carefully neutral. Officer Rivera, her nameplate read. She'd seen this before. I could tell by the way she didn't flinch when the bank manager whispered something in her ear. "Your husband has been accessing this account," she said, sliding a printed statement toward me. The numbers made my stomach collapse. $47,000. Gone in 8 months. My hands shook as I traced the withdrawals. Regular deposits, my mother's pension, her modest investments, systematically drained to zero. Marcus's signature on the POA documents. Documents I'd never seen. Documents my mother, in her final months of illness, must have signed in a fog of medication and trust. "He told me she wanted to help with our mortgage," I whispered. Officer Rivera's jaw tightened. "She's been deceased for 3 days, and he's made 2 more attempts to withdraw from the account this week." The bank flagged it as suspicious activity. The room tilted. My mother had died protecting me from something I was too blind to see. She'd gone to her grave knowing what he was doing and said nothing, probably to spare me the choice between my marriage and the truth. "There's more," Rivera said, sliding another document across the desk. My blood turned to ice. There were other accounts, other names, other women's retirement funds, traced back years. The detective's office smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Detective Holloway, a woman with silver streaking her dark hair, had spent the last 6 hours building a timeline that rewrote every memory I thought I owned. Marcus wasn't just a thief. He was a predator with a system. He targeted vulnerable women, elderly, isolated, recently widowed. He'd volunteer at senior centers, offer handyman services, build trust over months. Then he'd position himself as a financial advisor, convince them he could help manage their estates, and drain them dry. My mother had been number 7. "We have 4 confirmed victims willing to press charges," Holloway said, her fingers drumming against a thick folder. "Your mother's case makes 5. There are possibly 3 more we're still locating." I felt numb, hollowed out. Every date night when he said he was working late. Every business trip. Every tender moment. Had it all been performance? Was there anything real? Or had I married a man who simply hadn't targeted me yet? "Where is he now?" I asked. "We're bringing him in for questioning within the hour." "He doesn't know we know yet." My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Baby, where are you? I'm worried sick. Come home." The casual cruelty of it, the calculated concern, the possessiveness disguised as love, made something crystallize inside me. He wasn't panicking about being caught. He was panicking about losing control of me. Holloway leaned forward. "We need your full cooperation."
Can you do that?
I nodded, but my mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning something she couldn't possibly understand. The wiretap was installed on our home phone within 48 hours. Detective Holloway positioned me as the bait. I was supposed to act normal, go home, play the confused wife until they had enough recorded evidence to make the charges stick. But normal is impossible when you're living with a monster who's finally realized you know. Marcus came home that evening with flowers. Expensive ones, the kind he never bought me. His smile was perfect, practiced, the same smile he'd used on my mother in her final weeks. He kissed my forehead like I was something precious he needed to keep contained. "Terrible day," he said, pouring wine with steady hands. "The police came to the office. Some ridiculous misunderstanding about your mother's account." I explained everything. How she wanted to gift us money, how the paperwork must have gotten confused. I watched him lie with such ease that I understood. He'd been lying longer than we'd been married. The man I thought I knew had never existed. I'd married a stranger wearing a human suit. "They believe you?" I asked carefully. "Of course. It's all documented. Your mother signed everything voluntarily." He touched my face. "I would never do anything to hurt you, Claire. You know that." The tenderness in his voice made my skin crawl. I realized then that the worst part wasn't the theft or the betrayal. It was that he genuinely believed his own performance. He thought he was the hero of the story, a man protecting his interests, managing resources, doing what needed to be done. That night, I heard him on the phone in his office, voice low. "We need to move the timeline up. She's asking questions." The recordings changed everything. Detective Holloway played them for me in her car, parked 3 blocks from our house, so Marcus wouldn't see us together. My hands went numb listening to his voice plotting what came next. He was planning to have me committed. "She's becoming unstable," he told someone on the phone, his lawyer, I'd later learn. "Paranoid, obsessing over her mother's death, making accusations." I've documented everything. The emotional spiral, the irrational behavior. A psychiatrist I know will sign off on it. Once she's institutionalized, I control everything, her assets, her mother's estate, all of it. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. "Trust your instincts, Claire. The ones you ignore are the ones that haunt you." I'd ignored every instinct that screamed about Marcus. Every time he'd isolated me from friends. Every time he'd controlled the finances. Every time he'd made me question my own perception of reality. I'd called it love. I'd called it partnership. "We have enough," Holloway said quietly. "But we need you to do one more thing." She pulled out a document. It was a financial power of attorney, nearly identical to the one my mother had signed. Pre-filled with my name. Waiting for Marcus's signature. "He's going to ask you to sign this tonight," Holloway said. "Let him think you will. We'll be listening." My heart hammered against my ribs. And then we arrest him the moment he realizes what he's done. But as I stepped out of that car and walked back toward my house, toward the man waiting inside with flowers and lies, I understood something Holloway didn't. I wasn't going to let the system decide his fate. I signed the document with a smile that felt like breaking glass. Marcus's face lit up with something that wasn't quite relief. It was satisfaction. The satisfaction of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. He poured champagne, pulled me close, whispered promises about our future while his hand trembled slightly as he notarized my signature. "You trust me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Completely." I lied, and the word tasted like poison. That night, after he fell asleep, I went to his office and found the psychiatrist's letter already drafted. Dr. Morrison, his colleague from college. The evaluation was already written, symptoms already documented, commitment papers already prepared. All they needed was my signature on the POA, and I'd be erased, a hysteric, an unreliable narrator of my own life. My mother had been right about one thing. The people who love you don't erase you. They don't steal from your grave while you're still warm in it. I made copies of everything. The financial records, the doctored psychiatric assessments, the recorded phone calls. I sent them to 7 news outlets, the state medical board, and the FBI's white-collar crime division. Not anonymously, with my full name and my testimony. Then I called Detective Holloway. "I'm ready," I said. The next morning, Marcus was arrested at his office in front of his colleagues. The news broke within hours. His face, finally stripped of that perfect mask, was everywhere. The charming financial advisor. The serial predator. The man who'd stolen from the dying while their families grieved. But what I hadn't anticipated was how the internet would respond when they learned his wife had brought him down. Some called me a hero. Others called me a liar, a gold digger, a woman scorned. The cruelty was almost as suffocating as his love had been. The trial lasted 4 months. I testified for 3 days straight, my voice steady even as Marcus's eyes tried to burn holes through me from the defendant's table. His lawyer painted me as unstable, vengeful, a woman destroying a good man out of spite. The prosecution showed the receipts, the forged documents, the victims whose life savings he'd stolen. My mother's case was the centerpiece. The jury wept when they saw her medical records, the cognitive decline from her cancer medication, the vulnerability Marcus had exploited with surgical precision. He'd visited her in the hospital, brought her soup, helped her organize her finances, while she was barely coherent from morphine. The verdict came on a Thursday, guilty on 12 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and attempted fraud against me. 23 years in federal prison. But victory tasted like ash. I'd won, and it had cost me everything. Our house was seized for restitution to his victims. My career had stalled. Every potential employer had Googled my name and saw only scandal. Friends I'd known for decades stopped returning my calls, uncomfortable with my proximity to darkness. My marriage, which had never been real, was now publicly dissected by strangers on the internet. The worst part was the silence after. The trial ended, the news cycle moved on, and I was left standing in the wreckage of a life I'd built on quicksand. I moved into a small apartment and started therapy. Detective Holloway sent me a note. You did the right thing. But right and whole are different things. One evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a check for $47,000, my mother's stolen savings, recovered and returned by the court. Attached was a handwritten note in my mother's shaky handwriting, dated weeks before she died. I know what he's doing. I'm letting him, because I needed you to see him clearly. I love you enough to be the cost of your freedom. I held that letter for so long the paper nearly dissolved in my hands. My mother had known. She'd walked into that final darkness with her eyes open, letting him steal from her grave so I'd have no choice but to see the truth. She'd sacrificed her legacy, so I'd reclaim my life. That wasn't weakness. That was the fiercest love I'd ever known. I used the $47,000 to start over. Not in the way Marcus would have wanted, not lavishly, not performatively. I used it to build something small and honest. I became a victim advocate, helping other women recognize the patterns I'd missed. The isolation, the financial control, the gaslighting disguised as devotion. Marcus wrote letters from prison, begging forgiveness, claiming he'd changed. I never opened them. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give. It belonged to his victims, and most of them wanted nothing to do with redemption narratives. 2 years later, I received news that one of his earlier victims, a woman named Dorothy, had passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family he'd nearly destroyed. Her daughter called to thank me. She spent her final months with dignity, because of you, she said. Because you refused to let him win. I visited my mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone read her name, her dates, and beneath it, she loved fiercely and trusted wisely. I finally understood. She hadn't trusted Marcus. She'd trusted me. She'd trusted that when pushed to the edge, I'd choose truth over comfort, justice over peace. Standing there, I felt the weight lift. Not entirely, never entirely, but enough to breathe. I was no longer the woman who'd pulled a soggy savings book from a trash bin at her mother's funeral. I was the woman who'd transformed that moment into purpose. I was the woman who'd won.